All right, so we're going to pick up on chapter 26 right here, starting at part two. Just a quick review of what we covered in part one. In the 1950s, the American economy is booming, absolutely booming. And there's a lot of comparisons that people try to draw between the 1920s and the 1950s, which are two decades which do have a lot of similarities and a lot of differences as well. Both decades followed a world war. Both decades saw a booming economy. Both decades saw a Red Scare that kind of created a sense of conformity and kind of ultra patriotism and the sense of wanting to fit in. But there are also some differences between the 1920s and 1950s. One of the most significant differences is that the boom of the 1920s was a little bit more fragile than people thought at the time. People thought it was this really strong, booming economy, but it was kind of all built on a house of cards and magical fairy dust because people, the large corporations and industrialists and capitalists were kind of pushing this consumer culture in order to get people to buy their surplus of goods that they had. After World War One, they converted from making goods for the war to goods, just general consumer goods. They had a surplus, and they created this artificial demand for it. Eventually, people didn't have the money to keep up with that artificial demand. That's one of the things that led to the Great Depression. That will not happen in the 1950s. The demand that exists for those consumer goods is not artificial. People have more money and more financial stability in the 1950s than they did in the 1920s. And we don't have a post-war downturn because the amount of money that we're spending on the war doesn't go anywhere, because we go straight from World War II to the Cold War. And so there's this idea that we need to maintain this level of production. But overall, what we're talking about is this massive economic boom in the 1950s. That is the strongest the American economy has ever been. That we have more than made up for any losses that we had in the Great Depression. The Great Depression feels like a distant memory, even though it was only a decade earlier. Our economy is absolutely booming. We more than double our GDP, and then more than double it again in a matter of 25 or 30 years. Um, we have a $5 billion trade surplus. This is because the United States is the number one exporter of manufactured goods in the world. We got factories everywhere. They're producing all kinds of consumer goods. We are selling those in the United States, but around the world. In the post-World War II kind of new world order that's being created and established, the United States, just like we did with the United Nations and diplomacy, just like we did with organizations like NATO and our military presence, we created something called the Bretton Woods economic system, which included the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, all of which kind of combine to create an global economy in which the United States really is at the center of the entire thing. We're opening up more and more markets to be able to sell our goods. We're making the dollar the central currency in the world. And so all of that adds up to the United States, as I said before, becoming a major exporter of industrial goods, which means tons of factories, which means tons of factory jobs. Not only are American businesses booming during this time period, but the amount of wealth that's being created is actually more widely shared among workers and all Americans than it was at any previous point in American history. We've seen the economy boom before in the 1880s and 1890s, when the economy was booming, but all of that money was kind of being held by a small group of people at the top of the economy. And we actually saw an expansion of the number of people living in poverty, even though the economy was booming in the 1880s and 1890s. Well, that's not the case in the 1950s. We've gone through the Progressive Era. We've gone through the New Deal. We've seen this shift in the way that government sees its role in regulating businesses, protecting consumers, and protecting workers, et cetera, et cetera. So we have the highest level of union membership that we've ever had in American history in the 1950s, while simultaneously having the biggest, most prosperous economic boom that we've ever had in American history. And so the economy is doing very well. Most Americans are experiencing the benefit. More and more Americans are experiencing the benefits of that booming economy. And this is why the 1950s is kind of seen by people in America during that time period, and still some people today who are nostalgic for it, as kind of the high watermark of American history, or even the high watermark of global history. That this was a moment in which We had perfected civilization, that we had a better standard of living in the United States in the 1950s than anybody else had in the world or had ever had in the world. And a big part of that story, a big part of that belief, which really was some bit propaganda, but a big part of that story was the suburbs. And there's a big difference between the 1920s and 1950s as well. We're going to talk a lot more about the suburbs in parts 2 and 3. But you can't understand the 1950s and this whole concept of what it means to be an American and what this expected standard of life is for Americans and the American dream without understanding the suburbs and the creation of the suburbs. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. But it's important to note that the suburbs basically didn't exist, or barely existed, I guess you could say, prior to the 1940s. It is a project that comes about in the 1940s is going to fundamentally change the way that Americans live, the way that Americans see themselves, the kind of standard of living that Americans expect themselves to have. And so that's, again, kind of a key piece to this story that we're going to dive into here. So part 2 is called The American Family in the Era of Containment. You can't talk about this time period without talking about the baby boom. Yes, this is the boomers, the boomer generation, okay, boomer, all that jazz. The baby boom includes that generation, the baby boom generation, anybody who was born between 1945 and 1965. As you can see on the graph on the slide, there is a huge increase between the first half of the 1940s and the second half of the 1940s, the number of babies being born a year in the United States. There's a huge increase from 1945 to the 1950s, and it stays pretty much level until you get to the mid 60s, and then it really drops off. So what accounts for that massive spike of babies being born? Well, there's really 3 things that caused the baby boom. One, all the soldiers coming home from war, right? They've all been away. People aren't really able to get kind of their families going, get families started while the soldiers are away. A lot of people put off family planning decisions until after they got back from the war. People get back from the war, they want to celebrate, they get married, they start families, and all of a sudden a whole bunch of babies show up. Also, there's a really good economy, as we've been talking about already. If it's the middle of the Great Depression, you can barely feed the kids you already have. The idea of having yet another kid or more kids seems insane. Why would you have more kids if you can't even feed the ones that you have? But if the economy is booming, that's not even a thought, really, right? Kids are very expensive. But if the economy is booming, you just have the babies you want to have because everything's doing well economically. Also, during this time period, as is generally true across history, as we move forward in time, advancements in health and medicine get better, and they make it so that babies are healthier and live into adulthood more commonly, right? Like how many times do you hear people in like the 1820s? It's like, well, they had 13 kids and 8 of them made it to adulthood, and it's like, oh, they lost like 5 kids. It was just like more commonplace, right? Or even the number of pregnancies that didn't end up with a baby being born. Just advancements in health, advancements in medicine make it so that there is a lot more babies being born and a lot more babies actually surviving childhood. And this is a pretty a significant piece of this as well. What accounts for the drop off in 1965? In 1965, birth control was made widely available for sale on the market. And so people could choose to not have babies as much because they had opportunities to prevent something like that from happening. So that became widely available in 1965. So if you're born between 45 and 65, there's this huge boom of babies. And this has a kind of big psychological impact on the United States. Like we're a country that's nearly 200 years old at this point, but in many ways it feels like we're really just kind of getting started, or at least hitting our stride, right? We're the most powerful country in the world. Our economy is booming. We're the envy of everyone in the world. We think we've kind of perfected human civilization, and we have a very young country, a lot of young families of people who just came back from the war who are having babies. And it's a very exciting and thrilling time where it feels like there's a lot of energy, enthusiasm in the United States, which, as we'll talk about in a future chapter, helps kind of fuel the election of JFK as president, who is a very young, attractive, energetic president with young kids. Again, more on that on a future chapter, but it all kind of alludes to or contributes to this idea that the United States is a young, energetic nation. Other aspects of the American family worth noting during this time period is this question of the cult of domesticity, which we've been talking about all year long, right? Like that the United States and really places all over the world have this kind of separate spheres concept, right? And this cult of domesticity that women belong in the private sphere, men belong in the public sphere, men go off to work, men are involved in politics, they're involved in government, women stay home, they take care of the kids, they take care of the house, they take care of the housework, et cetera, et cetera. That's been with us since the very beginning of the United States. But we've also seen at various points throughout our country's history that cult of domesticity, that wall between the public and the private sphere, be challenged in a lot of ways, right? You've heard me say it a bunch of times before. Every time we have this burst of industrialization in the United States, there's a increase in the number of women who work outside the home. Because when there's a burst of industrialization, that means there's an increase in demand for labor that oftentimes calls upon women to fill, right? And so we saw it in the 1820s and 30s. We saw a burst of industrialization. More women, really the first time women went to go work in the workplace into the public sphere. We saw it in the post-Civil War 1870s and 80s. We saw it during World War One, and here now we see it again during World War II. And what is also true is that every time we see women go into the public sphere for work, once they find themselves in the public sphere, they also lean into the other aspects of being in the public sphere, being advocates, being activists, being people who are interested in being involved in politics, et cetera, right? And so, if you just go back to World War One, a huge increase in demand for labor, which led to a lot of women going to work, that a lot of women entering into the public sphere had a huge impact on getting the 19th Amendment ratified and leading to the women's suffrage, right? So here we find ourselves in World War II, and it's this greatest number of women who have gone to work for a wage outside the home than we've ever had in American history. It'll only go up from there. It's only going to go up from there. More and more women going to the workplace to work for a wage. And so this again challenges our old notions of domesticity, of separate spheres, et cetera, et cetera. By the time we get to 1960, 30% of all wives work. That's nearly 1 out of every 3 married women who go to work outside the home. Now, this is significant too, because even in the past, when we've seen these huge upticks in the number of women who work, oftentimes it's young women who will work until they get married, and then they'll quit and kind of join the domestic life that they're quote unquote meant for, right? But in 1960, you see 30% of all wives work, right? And between 1850 and 1860, the number of mothers who worked is increased by a factor of 4. And that's a really big deal, because back then it really was pretty controversial if you were supposed to be home taking care of your kids, but now you're out and you have a job, etc. One other thing is worth noting is it's been quite some time. We're talking primarily about middle class Americans, right? Because even back in the 1880s and 1890s, we saw a lot of families where not only did the mom and dad have to work, but even some of the kids had to work too before we had child labor laws. And so if you're working class, if you're poor, it's far more common that multiple members of the family work in this kind of separate spheres. Cultural domesticity thing is not as much a reality. But what we see now is even more middle class women who don't need to work as far as being able to make the income to help the family survive are choosing to work and challenging those gender norms. One other piece I want to throw on this before we move on is we also see the emergence of something that is now known as the second shift for women. And it's something that still very much, I would say, is alive and prevalent in our society today. And I'll give you an example after I explain what it is. So if it used to be that the man would go to work all day long and the woman stayed home to take care of the duties at home, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the kids and everything else that requires. Now that both the husband goes to work and works for 8 hours a day and the wife goes to work and works for 8 hours a day, you would think that there may be more shared responsibilities in taking care of the the work at home, the homework, right? But that's not what happens. It's not going to happen for quite some time. So now we have women in a position where they go to work 8 hours a day, just like their husband does, and then they go home and they're still responsible for all of the duties at home: cooking, cleaning, taking care of the kids, et cetera, et cetera. That's why it's called the double shift. It's almost like women have two full-time jobs, being a housewife and a mom, and whatever job they actually have. And so it's going to be quite some time before those gender norms are going to be challenged even more decades down the road. And you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, like my mom and dad at home share our gender roles. Even my dad stayed home, my mom works. So how could you claim that this second shift still exists today? Well, if you look at the statistics during 2020, when you look at how COVID impacted the economy and who works, a vast majority, north of 90% of the people who lost their job during the COVID pandemic economic downturn were women. And a lot of those were women voluntarily choosing to leave their job because they had kids at home who weren't able to go to school, and they needed someone to do homeschooling, and or not homeschooling, but remote learning, and help them with all that. And is a vast majority of the people who and left their jobs in order to stay home and help with the responsibilities at home were women. So it's difficult to explain why that is unless you accept the reality that we still have some remnants of this cult of domesticity sticking with us. Why wouldn't it be an equal number of men and women who left their jobs, or decreased their hours, or things like that? And it's very clearly because we still have, all of these decades later, even after we think we've advanced in many ways, although we have of course advanced, but we still have the hangover of this kind of separate spheres cult of domesticity with us. One last point I'll make is, even though more and more women are going to work, it's not as though they had a lot of opportunities for jobs. Most of the jobs that were available to women in the 1950s and 60s were secretarial jobs, or those types of things, compared to men. So it's not like a lot of women were finding themselves with a wide range of options. There was still a lot of discrimination in the workplace during that time period. So we see this huge baby boom. More and more people are having more and more babies. And at the same time, you see a lot of women kind of challenging those kind of traditional gender roles in the cult of domesticity. And we see these kind of changing notions of what family is during the 1950s. That brings us to part three, a suburban nation. So if you think about this, all of a sudden people are having loads and loads and loads of babies during the baby boom. We're going to need a lot more space to put everybody. So in 1945, when the war ended, we had a massive housing shortage in the United States. Nobody was really building houses during the Great Depression because nobody was buying houses in the Great Depression, right? People couldn't even afford to stay in the houses they had. So why would you build homes if there's no demand? Why would you provide the supply if there's no demand? Then during World War II, so many of the resources that we had in the United States were going towards the war effort. So really nobody was building homes then either. Then in 1945 and beyond, as our economy begins to improve and then starts to boom, and more people are making more and more money, there's this huge demand for housing, and there's not enough supply, right? And so there's a huge housing shortage. Well, the decision that's kind of made at the level of the federal government is that the government will help provide housing. Not that they're going to build it, but they're going to help provide a whole bunch of incentives for builders and for developers to build a bunch of new homes. And they have a very specific way they want that done. And this leads to suburbia. This leads to the creation of the suburbs, right? So there's a few different reasons why that we're attracted to creating these suburbs. Something that did not exist anywhere else in the world, something that had never existed really in the United States before. This is a brand new concept. Well, first and foremost, there's a lot of really cheap farmland just outside the cities that's available to be bought. So it might be a lot easier to just go get a blank slate, a big flat piece of property, and build a whole bunch of homes on it than it would be to go into cities where there's already buildings that exist and try to get people back into the apartment complexes, or try to refurbish old apartment complexes, or try to build new projects in cities that already have all of this building. It might be easier just to go a little bit outside of town, buy a big old farm, big old bunch of flat land, and just build homes out there. Also, a big part of the suburbs was, again, part of this story that we're telling the world and ourselves, that America in the 1950s is the pinnacle of human civilization, that Americans in the 1950s have a better standard of living, have a better lifestyle than anyone anywhere else in the world. And the suburbs are a key part of that story. It's a lot different standard of living. It's a lot different quality of life when you have a big 3 or 4 bedroom house with a kitchen and a living room and a dining room and a 2-car garage and a front yard and a backyard, and that kitchen is filled with all the newest, greatest appliances that are coming straight out of the factories and all the consumer goods, and you filled all the rooms with all the newest, best furniture and all that other stuff. It just gives this overall sense that the quality of life that Americans are living, that the American dream has been redefined, and that people in America, the average American, not, you don't have to be wealthy, that the average American is living a standard of living, a standard of life, quality of life that is better than the average person in most other places in the world, even wealthy people in most other places in the world. So the government wants to help create help solve this housing shortage, and in doing so help create this new mindset and this new idea of what it means to be an American, of what the American lifestyle is. And so they do this a few different ways. Through the Federal Housing Authority, which was created during the New Deal. You may remember the Federal Housing Authority was created during the New Deal along with the Homeowners Loan Corporation to help people stay in their homes, to help people refinance their loans and give them government loans so they don't owe as much money. Well, that organization that was created during the New Deal is now going to be repurposed to basically give out loads of government cash to developers. They want to encourage developers and encourage builders to build as many homes as they possibly could out in these brand new suburbs. So basically, let's imagine that it costs you $5,000 to build a home if you're a builder, right? The government's going to give you a government subsidy that's going to offset that by 50%. So now it's going to cost you $2,500 to buy a home instead of $5,000. That allows the builder to save a lot of money. Also, now the builder can sell that home for $300,000 instead of, or let's say $400,000 instead of $600,000. So that makes it more affordable for people who want to buy those homes too. So it's the government kind of this government, cash flow that's going to developers, that's making it cheaper for them to build the homes, and it's also making it then cheaper for people to buy the homes. And encouraging people to not only the suburbs to be built, but nor encouraging people to move out to the suburbs as well. Another government program that's going to help these suburbs get built out is something called the Veterans Authority, which creates something called the GI Bill, or the GI Bill of Rights. This is a program where basically, if you are a World War II veteran, the government wants to say thank you. And there's two major pieces of this program that help, that the government uses to help people who were veterans. If you're a veteran of World War II, the government would pay for you to go to college for free. Free and clear, will pay for you to go. My grandpa went to Stanford and Cal Berkeley for free, paid for by the federal government because he was in the Navy in World War II. But the other piece of the GI Bill, it's called the GI Bill of Rights, or the GI Bill, which came through the Veterans Authority, was low finance home loans. So let's say that you are someone who came back from World War II, and you're part of the baby boom. You got a couple of babies and little kids popping around. You want a little bit of space. Now you can go out to the suburbs where the houses have already been um, have already been uh, um, um, uh, already been reduced in price because the federal government, through the Federal Housing Authority, has provided funding to reduce the price. But also, you've gotten this government loan with a low interest rate. So from both ends of the deal, from the people who are selling it to the people who are buying it, they're being backed by the government in order to encourage people to move out to these suburbs and to be able to buy these suburbs. Now, this leads to, as we talked about earlier in the lecture, this huge increase in homeownership. For most of the 1900s, homeownership was about 45%. About 45% of Americans owned homes. By the time we get to 1960, that's 60%. So we go from a majority of Americans are renters to a majority of Americans are owners, basically from like 1945 to 1960. This is a huge shift. And I will remind you something I said way back at the beginning of the lecture, not on this recording, but when I started the lecture however long I did, that owning a home is a huge contributor to your personal wealth. That the difference between someone who owns a home and doesn't own a home, as far as their wealth, it's a huge gap because that asset has a lot of value, and that gives you a lot more wealth and a lot more economic freedom and independence than it does if you don't own that. So this is a huge opportunity for many Americans to be able to put themselves in a much more economically sound, strong situation. And just to underscore how many homes are being built, by the time we get to 1960, a quarter of all the homes that existed in the United States in 1960 did not exist a decade earlier, right? And so one of the greatest examples, or one of, I guess, the most perfect examples of this kind of suburban development is a town called Levittown, which was built outside of New York. It's a suburb, and there were two brothers, last name Levitt, which is why it's called Levittown, who got a whole bunch of money from the federal government in order to build these homes, and really kind of perfected this process of being able to bang out homes very cheaply and very quickly, and being able to, they got to a point where they were putting together like whole cities, where if you kind of drove by farm fields, one day, and you came back 6 months later and drove through again, all of a sudden the farms wouldn't even be there anymore. It'd be a whole city that's teeming with life, a whole town, suburban town, in a matter of 6 months. This is all possible because of a number of things. One, I've already talked extensively about government assistance, but two, it's this booming economy, right? It's this, that the United States has created this Bretton Woods economic system. All these things are connected. This Bretton Woods economic system that has allowed us to export our goods all over the world, that has allowed us to help set interest rates all over the world, that has allowed us to, as a country, to redefine the suburb or the global economy in a way that benefits us. That leads to a lot of really good jobs in American factories. I said before, I'll say again, you can graduate from high school, go directly to work in a factory, and get paid well enough to be able to buy one of these 3 or 4 bedroom suburban homes if you're a single income family with no college education. That's something that, is shows how well people were paid in these factories and how much better these factory jobs were now than they were 50 or 60 years earlier. So this is why I'm saying the suburbs are really kind of the central piece to this entire conversation, right? All of these consumer goods that we're making in these factories that we're exporting all over the world are also things that's driving this huge consumer culture in the United States. People want to fill up their suburban homes with the newest, shiniest home appliances. I'm going to go back a few slides here. Take a look at these images, two of these images of the woman in the kitchen. Do the one on the bottom right. She's got the new toaster, the new coffee maker, the new, I don't know, what is that, a waffle maker, the new pots, the new pans. If you look out the window, the husband's out there with a new car. She's got that brand new oven, right? The brand new sparkling kitchen in the suburban home with the cars, the 2-car garage. You filled your home with all these consumer goods, which are now feeling more and more like a necessity instead of a luxury, because this is what allows you to keep up that suburban lifestyle, to have that American standard of life, to fulfill the American dream in this kind of world of suburbia, right? So this is where we've come. Now, a very important piece to this is to recognize that this project, this huge suburban project that's being spurred on by the American government, that's being built up by these developers, is in fact a segregation project. Because it was, if you got money as a builder from the federal government and the Federal Housing Authority, if they said, we're going to give you, we're going to subsidize each of the homes you built by a certain amount of money, those contracts always included a clause that said you were not allowed to sell those homes to people who were not white. You had to only sell them to white people. The suburbs were only open to white people. It wasn't open to people of color. Also, there were a lot of people of color who fought in World War II, but they did not have access to the GI Bill of Rights. That was only made available to white people too. So, well, that's not exactly right. The GI Bill of Rights was made available to everybody, but you couldn't use your GI Bill of Rights funding to be able to go and buy a suburban home if you were someone who was a person of color. So basically what we see here is that there's this kind of this huge exodus from urban centers, from cities to the suburbs by white Americans, leaving behind people of color into the cities. And even if people of color had the ability, the financial ability to buy homes in the suburbs, it was illegal for them to do so. There were real estate agents who were arrested and sent to jail for trying to sell homes to African Americans when it was against the law to do so in many, pretty much all of the suburbs throughout the United States. So this basically includes a giant segregation of the North and the West. That's just as bad, if not worse, than it is in the South. So we leave all the people of color behind in the cities, and poor whites, and middle class and wealthy whites all move out to the suburbs. And all of the government funding, all of the government resources that go to pay for schools and parks and all the things that make a standard of life better go to the suburbs, and the cities are kind of left behind in disrepair. And you see crime rates increase in the cities. You see the quality of schools decrease in cities. You see the number of buildings that kind of are falling apart, and regular everyday infrastructure that people need to thrive in a city is not being invested in. And so the quality of life for people of color in the city is deteriorating, while this almost dreamlike quality of life in the suburbs, which has become the envy of the world, which has become the hallmark of what it means to be an American and have the American experience and live the American dream, is only available to white Americans. And so if you go back to the very beginning of this lecture again, not this recording, but the lecture, when I talked about the analogy of the 1950s, this is kind of very calm, very cool backyard barbecue where everybody's having a good time. It's laid back, easy going. Old grandpa President Eisenhower's flipping burgers on the grill. Everybody's having a good time. I said that's not really an accurate portrayal, because there's actually a whole bunch of people in the neighborhood who weren't invited to the backyard barbecue. So that's what I'm talking about. People of color were not part of this wonderful kind of idyllic, new American dream of the 1950s in the suburbs. They weren't invited into that. So this is known as white flight, when all of these, basically all white people from the North and the West, leave the cities and go to the suburbs, and then leave behind people of color in the cities. And so we start to see this huge divide between the two, this huge, like I said, segregation project. Another significant program that the federal government spends lots of money on in order to encourage suburban development is something called the National Interstate Defense Highway Act. There were 42,500 miles of highway built in a 10-year period during the 1950s and into the 1960s. This was started by President Eisenhower. And the justification for it was, if the Soviets invade the United States or attack us, we're going to need to evacuate the cities quickly. So we need to have this big, robust highway system. The secondary justification for it was the highway system is going to expand our economy the same way that the railroad system did in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, the same way did that roads and canals did in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. It's about creating more connection. It's about creating more connections between these markets. But but the thing that people don't talk about as much is that this is a key piece to suburbanization, because if you live out in the suburbs and you're trying to get to the city and all you have is roads, it's going to cause huge traffic jams. So you build these big highways that connect the suburbs to the cities, and now everybody who lives in the suburbs, who work in the cities, have an easy way to get in and out from the cities to the suburbs every day, which is also, as we'll talk about on another slide, what creates this huge reliance and dependence on cars in the suburbs. It is a car culture. In the cities, people walk. In the cities, people take public transportation. In the cities, things are built closer together and more densely so that people can get around much easier. That is not how the suburbs are built. We all know that. We live here. You have to get in your car and drive anywhere in order to do that. People are car dependent, and it creates a whole car culture. People start to really identify and connect to their cars in a way, and it dramatically expands the number of people who own cars. 25 million Americans owned cars in 1945. 75 million Americans owned cars in 1960. So we've tripled the number of people who own cars in the United States in a matter of 15 years. Also, not surprisingly, the amount of oil consumption in the United States triples during this time period as well, which is going to have huge disastrous impacts and implications for the United States over the next few decades. But at the time, this car culture and this dependency on cars is seen as just part of the package of the American dream that was emerging during this time period. And again, if not for the government spending money on building these highways, it should be noted that the National Interstate Defense Highway Act cost more money than any single New Deal program, right? All of those New Deal programs that some people called socialist and so on and so forth, this program costs more money than any of those. So it's the government spending money on these highways that allow for the suburbs to be able to be built out and have access. It's the government creating the GI Bill that gives white veterans the opportunity to be able to use those funds to use low interest rates to be able to buy homes. It's the government subsidizing the development of these homes. And all of that, again, is creates this wall between whites and blacks, as whites can settle in these areas and blacks can't. To kind of go double down on car culture, this is the time period in which pretty much all fast food places that are the classic fast food places were created in the 1950s in Southern California, which is the epicenter of car culture in Southern California. LA was really kind of the first real American city built after the car became commonly used, which is why LA is so spread out. If you go to New York, if you go to Philadelphia, you go to Boston, all of those cities were built when walking around was the best form of transportation, right? And then later trains, which contributed to them being much more dense. If you go to LA, if you go to Phoenix, if you go to places in the American Southwest, they're very widespread out. There's a lot of sprawl because car was the newest, most exciting type of transportation. So all these fast food places are started in Southern California. People want to pull up in their car, get the food real quick, get in, get out. Shopping malls become a very popular way to spend some time during this time period. Now in the city, you might take the trolley car down and go shopping and go to this shop and this shop and this shop. They're all in the same block. But this idea that you kind of create one large building that's one-stop shopping with a massive parking lot where you pull up in your car and you go and you do your shopping and you get in your car and you come back. It all connects to this car culture. And another thing I would have you notice in that picture of the mall is the palm trees. One of the other aspects of suburbanization is this idea that it is happening everywhere in the United States, but it's happening far more in something called the Sun Belt than it is anywhere else. So what is the Sun Belt? The Sun Belt is pretty much the American South and the American West. It's this area where it's much warmer. And we're going to see this huge migration of Americans during this time period to the Sun Belt. Why? Well, one, highways make these areas a lot more accessible than they used to be, so you could drive there. Two, there's a lot of jobs in these areas because that's where a lot of the defense industry exists, a lot of the factories to build stuff for World War II and the Cold War. That's why I told you the Bay Area and Richmond was a huge spot with a ton of jobs. And also, interestingly enough, advancements in air conditioning make those summers bearable. So during this time period, in fact, the number one indicator of population growth during the 1950s and 60s was January temperature. The higher the January temperature, the higher population growth was in those areas. People were moving away from cold areas and to warm areas, moving to the Sun Belt. One example of this is Orange County, California, which in 1940 had about 140,000 people and 20 years later had over 700,000. So that's a huge growth in that one county. Now, as you see the migration to the south and to the west, there'll also be some political shifts that happen because as more people move to those areas, that means those people get more members of Congress. That means they have more of a voice. More on that in a future chapter, but I just wanted to plant that seed right now. So suburbanization is happening in New York and Boston and Buffalo and Detroit, yes, but it's happening far more in Florida, Georgia, Texas, and California than it is anywhere else. So when I directed your attention to those palm trees, the image of suburbanization, the image of this kind of American dream and standard of life is that you hop in your car, you cruise around, it's warm weather, it's palm trees, it's the suburban lifestyle, right? That we kind of all associate and was made popular in movies with Southern California, right? And that's kind of the tale of the entire Sun Belt right there. But as I alluded to, or as actually I allude to, I talked about in pretty significant detail, this is going to lead to a major problem in the United States. By the time we get to 1968, it has become abundantly evident that we have a major segregation problem between rural areas and urban areas. And there's suburban areas. in urban areas. And there's a lot of problems in the cities. We see increased crime, we see increased violence, we see increased clashing between police and residents of cities. We see increased poverty. We see increased blight, which is kind of like buildings that are in disrepair and so on and so forth. And the government actually put together a commission to do a report to kind of say what's going on in the cities. Why are our cities struggling so much? It's a big long report that says a whole bunch of stuff, but it all can be summed up in this one quote. This is called the Kerner Report, by the way, 1968. It says our nation is moving towards two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. One suburban, one urban. We're not talking about the American South. We're not talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. We're talking about policies that were created specifically by the federal government that allowed white people to buy homes in certain areas in the suburbs and did not allow African Americans. And that led to a huge gap in opportunity, in wealth, in access to certain things that again still haunts us, I would say, today. We are certainly getting to a point in our history curriculum in which we can very much see the ramifications of these things today. If you were to walk around in any suburban town anywhere in America, chances are it would be predominantly white. If you were to walk around in any city anywhere in America, especially in the lower income areas, chances are it would be predominantly people of color. Of course, these are generalizations. That's not to say that this is a universal truth, but generalizations. So we are very much still dealing with these issues today. In fact, in 2018, which would have been the 40, 50, 60th anniversary of the Kerner Report, they did a follow-up on the Kerner Report to say, how have we come along since the Kerner Report? If in 1968 we identified that we are creating this huge problem with segregation, how have we done over the last 60 years? Well, the report in 2018 said we are in fact more segregated in 2018 than we were in 1968. So at the beginning of the school year, when I say we have a lot of problems in our country today, and the only way we can try to solve those problems if we understand how those problems were created, this is the stuff I'm talking about. It wasn't accidental that white people moved to the suburbs and people of color did not. It wasn't just, well, there's a bunch of racist real estate agents that don't want to sell them homes. It was official government policy. Oftentimes we call it redlining now because there were maps, actual maps where they drew red lines around the areas where you weren't allowed to sell to black people. So it's called redlining now. Actual government policies that prohibited African Americans to be able to buy homes. And those policies existed in some places all the way through the 70s and 80s. I was born in 1983. So I will again kind of do a callback to one of my kind of common points that I like to make is when people say, oh, slavery ended in 1865. How come black people haven't been able to advance or people of color haven't been able to advance? Well, there's a whole bunch of other stuff post-slavery, all the way up until even my own lifetime, that were official government policies that prohibited people from being able to succeed, enjoy in the level of prosperity that Americans are becoming more and more accustomed with during this time period. And these are still things that we're trying to kind of unravel a little bit and think through. And the question that a lot of people ask is it the government's responsibility to try to raise up communities that are still struggling? And oftentimes the answer is, well, just as much effort as the government put into discriminating against these communities, maybe an equal amount of effort should be put into trying to help them. But where we are leaving off in the 1960s, 1950s, and 1960s is this image of America, the suburban, wealthy, prosperous image of America is one that many people still hold nostalgia for from the 1950s. But it is not the full story. So understanding that full, well-rounded story is important. So this is the economic boom of the 1950s. This is the suburbanization of the 1950s. This is the 1950s nostalgic, kind of dream-like, perfect, perfection of human civilization. But when you really look beyond the surface, you can see that there's a little bit that still needs to be worked on. All right. If you're still awake, that's the end of the lecture. Have a good day, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.